Hi, students of Paul. This is just a very, very short video, a few minutes, just to talk about critical methodologies, hermeneutics, and the use of the Bible. The main point here is to talk about the ways in which biblical studies is not the same as Bible studies. Bible studies are an in-group activity that take place within a worshiping faith community, and biblical studies are are often historical or literary, rhetorical in some other way, and they take place within a university or within an academic environment. Critical methodologies can certainly be used within a faith community, but biblical studies per se is an activity which, at least on the surface, ostensibly, first proceeds from a historical point of view that does not concern itself with whether the text is true in some existential way, but it's more interested in the historical detail and the archaeological detail and so on. So critical methodologies represent an attempt to read the texts in their context historically, as if intended for that time and those people. In other words, if you read Paul's letter to Thessaloniki, First Thessalonians, you don't read it, how does it apply to my life? You read it, how did it apply to the first readers, and to the first hearers, I should say, of that letter? In their literary contexts, how does First Thessalonians compare to Romans, which was written much later, in terms of its view of the coming parousia of Jesus, the inbreaking of the God of Israel and the day of the Lord? C, individually for what they are saying in themselves, i.e. respecting Isaiah's original message without reading it through the lens of Matthew or Genesis through the lens of Paul. When you're doing Bible study, you tend to see the Bible flatly and read one section in light of another within a faith community. Within biblical studies, you only look at something in its own context, in its own historical context and its own literary context. So in this sense, as I point out here, critical methodologies are quite different from Bible study, which tends to treat the Bible as a whole, canonically as a whole, and is open to using any part to interpret any other. That is not what happens in critical biblical studies, which are most often historical or literary. Canonicity and the canon within the canon. I do want to point out for any of you who may happen to be from a faith community that if there are different ways of thinking about the canon, that is the overall context of the Bible. One is, if something is in the Bible, it is in the Bible. Even if you say that, for instance, First Timothy was not written by Paul. If we decide it's pseudonymous, it's written by somebody else in Paul's name, note that it still is in the Bible. However, it is important to note that different churches have slightly different Bibles. So the Orthodox Bible is not quite the same as the Catholic Bible, which is not quite the same as the Protestant Bible. Canonicity exists regardless of authorship. So that is the point, that whether or not Paul wrote First Timothy, it's still a canonical New Testament text, which is therefore in some way authoritative for those within the Christian church. Secondly, for those who are Christians, to value authorship, what literary and critical methodologies show, higher than canonicity, is a decision about Scripture that values scientific evidence higher than dogma. And it's unconsciously reliant on the scientific revolution rather than the Scriptures themselves. So I'm just going to say, to privilege the critical methodology in terms of faith is its own problem sometimes. But I do feel that biblical studies as a critical discipline can give us information that may be helpful to those within faith communities. Despite what some Christians and churches say, I've never met a Christian or seen a church which truly reads the Bible flatly. That is, as if all parts are of equal value and every part equally interprets the other. There was this interesting book, I haven't read it, called A Year of Living Biblically, I think it's called, where a person tried to do everything and it was simply impossible. And why is that? Because the Bible is not a book. It is a collection of books written and what were scrolls written between the Tanakh and the Christian Testament, written over millennia, well, at least written over centuries, and which contain arguments within it. Some parts of that complicated set of texts argue with other parts, and there's a lot of intertextuality within it. It is impossible to do this with any collection of texts. We all consciously or unconsciously use one part of a collection or the interpretations of other people to interpret the whole. So canon within the canon. This brings us back to the question of hermeneutics. Hermeneutic is our usual way of looking at the world. So we may have a hermeneutic of suspicion, we may have a hermeneutic of hope, we may have a hermeneutic of trust, we may have a hermeneutic of fear. Luther wrote, and there's Luther and me. I was in Germany and saw this big picture of Luther during the Lutheran thing. Luther wrote that the scriptures are the cradle that holds Christ. And he translated into German. He was responsible for bringing the Bible into the vernacular, into the language of the people. But he certainly had a canon within a canon. He used one part of the Bible when he wanted to interpret other parts. So some tend to read everything through the Jesus of Mark, others through the Jesus of Luke, others through the Christ of Revelation, others through Paul. And by the way, they're not the same. The Christ of the Gospels is a teacher and a miracle worker and welcomes others in for the most part. The Christ of Revelation is this avenging judge for the most part who brings, for most of the book, terror and bloodshed to most of humanity. At the very end, it changes. Or some part of the letters. Almost no Christians interpret the whole of the Bible through the Psalms or through Leviticus. So we may, whether or not we are members of a community of faith or not, we may employ a justice or an economic or a patriarchal hermeneutic to what we read and see, among many other possibilities. I certainly think that some of those hermeneutics are better than others, but we will be talking more about that in the section on hermeneutics. Thank you for sitting with me through this, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.